as we'll talk about tonight, the entire reason for Amendment 2 is to allow policy. And so we need to know as much as we can about what those policies might be or are likely to be, and what they will mean for Kentuckians. So I'm going to jump right into the content now. Let's talk just first about the amendment itself. So Amendment 2, the change to the Constitution that Kentuckians will consider on Election Day, says, quote, the General Assembly may provide financial support for the education of students outside the system of common schools. Section 59, 60, 171, 183, 184, 186, and 189 of this Constitution notwithstanding. So that is what people, when they go into the voting booth, will look at. And a couple of things I want to say about this up front. We can go into more detail in the language later if folks have any questions, but it is very, very clear in sentence 1 of this that the intention of this amendment is to allow the General Assembly to fund education outside the system of common schools, which are also known as public schools. So it is crystal clear that this amendment is all about allowing the General Assembly to fund private schools. Second, as far as the first sentence, I think an important point is that this amendment provides no guardrails on how much the General Assembly might choose to spend or who may benefit from the spending. So how wealthy could a family be to receive support? There are no guardrails, no limits on that. What kind of private school could receive support? What sort of, could there be for-profit actors that receive support from the General Assembly? No guardrails whatsoever. So this amendment is written as broadly as possible. Secondly, 7 sections of the Constitution have to be notwithstood, or are being notwithstood in this amendment. And we can go in more detail if you want later, but these are all sections that in one way or another have put together and created the very strong commitment to public education we have in Kentucky. And so there were, the founders put in a lot of different mechanisms to ensure an efficient system of common schools, public education is a right, the General Assembly, that the General Assembly must use public dollars for public schools, that it cannot fund schools with a religious bent, and that public accountability be built in, that there be equality statewide. Those are some of the things that are being notwithstood here. So what is likely to happen if it passes? Again, the proponents don't want to talk about that, but it's all the more important that we do. You know, people vote for amendments for a reason. This is not being done to have a conversation. It's not being done as an academic exercise. It's being done to achieve some end. So what is that end? Well, the reality is we have very good evidence of where they are likely to go, the General Assembly, who put this on the ballot, if it passes. One is that this is the direct response to an effort, a couple of efforts actually, but the most recent was in 2021, to direct public money to private school through voucher programs. And in the case of that, it was House Bill 563. It passed the General Assembly. It was a voucher program that used tax credits to provide subsidies for private school tuition and expenses. As it was originally introduced, it was a pilot program. It was limited by income, but actually most households could have received it. It would have sunsetted after 5 years in the pilot program, and it had its cost capped initially. But even to give you another indication of where they might be going, even 1 year later after that bill passed, and before, while this bill was still being litigated in court, and the final ruling had not been reached on its legality, the General Assembly was already considering other bills to expand this program, to make higher income people eligible, to double or quadruple the cost, to end the sunset after 5 years, so that it continues in perpetuity. And one of those bills had 24 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. So we know there's a lot of interest in the General Assembly in these sorts of programs and in expanding these sorts of programs. However, this bill was ruled unconstitutional unanimously by the Kentucky Supreme Court, which shows the depth of our constitutional commitment to public education and to public dollars for public schools. So it was ruled unanimously unconstitutional. And that is what directly led to putting Amendment 2 on the ballot. So this is not a coincidental. This is what led to it. So these are the sort of programs that we know proponents would like to see. And I want to say a word about the word vouchers, because that is a word the proponents of Amendment 2 don't want to use. They want to avoid talking about vouchers because the experience in vouchers historically and the perception that voters have of vouchers is very negative. And so they're trying to run away from that term and run away from that policy. But every alternative that they've introduced in other states for funding of private schools has been a variation on the voucher that gets to the same end. So their vouchers is where the government is directly funding the provision of private education. There are also what they call education savings accounts in some states. These are not really savings accounts because it's just the government putting money into an account that a family draws down to pay for them to go to private school. So it works the same way as a direct voucher. A third variation, which is the one that we had in Kentucky before it was struck down, is to do it through the tax code, which is more convoluted, but basically a donor gets almost a dollar for dollar tax credit. It can even, sometimes it's even more than that. They can actually make money off the deal. They donate to an organization. That organization then provides a voucher to a student to go to private schools. These are all different means the same end. It's about taking public dollars and shifting them to private schools. So if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, you know it's probably a duck. So the other indication of where the General Assembly is likely to go, in addition to that law that got struck down, which by the way is still on the books. It's never been removed by the General Assembly. It's still there. It's just not operative. The other indication is what other similar states are doing, and states that the proponents of Amendment 2 point to as models. They say that these states are great and we should emulate them. So let's see what they're doing and let's see how much they're spending. And what we did was look at a number of states, 7 states that are, some are nearby, similar states, again, states that I point to as models, and see how much they're spending on private school voucher programs and make an apples to apples comparison by saying, looking at what they're spending as a share of their spending on public education at the state level. And you can see the raw totals on the left here. Florida now spending $4 billion. There's 2 states spending over $1 billion a year, other states that are spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And what has happened in a very, very short period of time is that the state spending on private school vouchers in states where these have taken hold are growing very rapidly. And you can see that there a number of these states are spending more than 5% of their of what they spend on the public education program on private school vouchers. They're spending double that now in Ohio. In Arizona, they're spending 16% of what they spend on public schools on vouchers, and in Florida, 31%. So the programs are really growing rapidly, and particularly as what typically happens, which is what happened in Kentucky, they start out with a more targeted program. Maybe it's only for low-income kids, maybe it's only for certain kinds of kids, and then they expand them very rapidly. And just in the last 2 years, 12 states have expanded their programs to make them universal, meaning that no matter how high the income of the family is, they are eligible to receive a voucher to go to private school. So that is one of the main reasons why the cost is really, really growing in these states. And I should say these states also, coming into this, had very similar populations in terms of private schools, in terms of who was already in private school. Some had a little more, some had a little less, but they were all very similar to where Kentucky is now going in. And yet this is what they're now spending because they chose to do this and they didn't have the constitutional protections that Kentucky has in place for public school funding. So we took those numbers and we simply translated them to Kentucky. Okay, if Kentucky was spending this much on private school vouchers, what would it mean for our budget? So we looked at three different models. One is that, okay, what if they spent 5% of what we spend on public schools? And that's less than all those states just mentioned, all 7 states. That would be $199 million a year if that's what the General Assembly did. And that's the equivalent to funding 1,645 public school teachers, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, and employees. So even a small program that's less than those other states would cost the equivalent of 1,600 public school employees. Um, if they were to go bigger, if they were to expand it over time to what Arizona is now doing, and that's very plausible because Arizona has fewer private school students as a share of their population than we do. It would cost $597 million. That's equivalent to funding 4,934 teachers and public employees and school employees. And then if they were to follow the path of Florida, which they continuously point to as a model of a great state for this, they would spend $1.19 billion, the equivalent of 9,869 public school employees. Now, another thing that the proponents of Amendment 2 want to say is that, well, this is not going to come out of the public school budget. Well, there's not extra money. The public school funding is the largest item in the state budget. Um, if it wasn't coming out of public school funding, it'd have to come out of infrastructure, it'd have to come out of higher education, it'd have to come out of somewhere, Medicaid. There are all good reasons to think they won't come out of there. The legislature has already made big cuts over the past couple of decades to public school funding, even before a voucher program goes into place. And the state is also slowly decreasing the individual income tax. I shouldn't say slowly, pretty rapidly decreasing the individual income tax, which is our biggest source, funds over 40% of the budget. And so the budget's going to be squeezed regardless. There's going to be less money. If you throw in a voucher program, you can better believe we're going to have less money for public schools. It's also plausible that just looking again at Kentucky's existing private school population, that the cost will be hundreds of millions of dollars, just given how many students there are already in private schools. 58,000 students now in private school, another 39,000 homeschooled, and many states provide vouchers for homeschool students as well. So the cost can easily reach what we see in some of these other states, just given that profile. And we know from other states that about 70% of vouchers tend to go to students already in private schools. So the major beneficiary of voucher programs are families already sending their kids to private school and paying for it. Now, who are those families and who are those children? Well, not surprisingly, families already sending their children to private school tend to have much higher incomes. If you look at the average income statewide of private school families, it's about $50,000 a year higher than the average public school family. So those who already have more means, who are using a portion of those means to pay for private school tuition, are the ones who are going to primarily benefit from a private school voucher program allowed by Amendment 2 that follows what these other states are doing. It's also the case that the racial makeup of the families most likely to benefit, those who are already in private school, tends to be wider than the public school population, both statewide. Even a bigger gap in that in counties like Jefferson County, which is a majority minority public school district at this point. So the divides that already exist in Kentucky in terms of race and income are likely to be widened if we allow a private school voucher program using public dollars. Another of the big divides in Kentucky that's likely to get wider is the rural-urban divide. Because if you look at where private schools are in Kentucky, they're very, very concentrated. And this map just shows, the map is the blue dots are a private school, a certified private school. The sort of yellowish dots are a public school. And you can see very clearly that the majority of private schools are in 3 counties, Jefferson County, Fayette County, and Kenton County. And the private schools are even more concentrated by neighborhoods. So they tend to be not only in urban areas or suburban areas, but in wealthier neighborhoods in those areas. In fact, 80% of private schools are in just 8% of Kentucky's zip codes. And then the related stat on this is that 75 counties, or 63% of our counties, have zero private schools. And of course, those tend to be in rural areas. So most of Kentucky, there's not a private school available. And we know the experience in other states is, again, most of the money goes to families already in private school. There are attempts usually when a private school voucher program is created to start up new private schools, but it turns out it's very expensive to operate a school. And so the schools that pop up, they're called pop-up uh, subprime private schools. They tend to, they don't have a lot of money. They tend to provide a low quality education. Many of them close within a few years and the kids end up back in public school, but having lost all the advantages of, lost a few years of education quality because, those schools just aren't able to operate even with a voucher. So the rural areas, without question, will lose because they just don't have private schools and are unlikely to have them even with a voucher program. Rural Kentucky will also lose because it it relies on state funding for their public schools at a higher level than our more prosperous areas because of low property wealth. Less property wealth, the state system of funding public education under our Constitution as it exists today, unless it's changed by Amendment 2, mandates a system of common schools throughout the state, which means, according to the state Supreme Court ruling in 1989, known as the Rose decision, that there needs to be an equitable system of schools, public schools across the state, which requires the state to create a formula, which they did in 1990, to better equalize that funding. So when you take dollars out of the public school budget at the state level, you're disproportionately taking dollars out of rural areas. So there's a second hit that our rural areas take. Not only do they not have private schools, but their budget is more dependent on state dollars. So when there are cuts, the hit tends to be harder. So when we looked at a Florida scale program, if Kentucky was to expand to a Florida scale program over time, uh, the rural areas would be harder hit. You can see the darker red in this map tends to be those counties. There are 14 rural districts, most in eastern Kentucky, some in southern and western Kentucky, that would see at least a 20% budget reduction if that money was taken out of public schools. And so those will be hit harder. But all districts rely on state funding to a certain degree to provide public education. So Jefferson County is wealthier on average, certainly, than most of the state, but $120 million of their budget, which helps fund the 100,000 students in that district, comes from the state. So when state dollars are reduced, I'm sorry, 120 million would be what they would lose in Jefferson County if we had a Florida scale program that cut state funding in that to that degree. That would come out of the funding that provides public education for those students. So all districts would be hurt, but rural districts the most. Okay, so our report, which is available on our website, kypolicy.org, provides all the details that I've talked about here in terms of laying out the what we know about school funding, what we know about what other states are doing in terms of their funding of private school vouchers, what that would mean if we did that in Kentucky, and then what that would mean at the local level. In addition to the full report, we've also created fact sheets that just describe that impact by district. So look at what that Florida scale program would mean if that was taken out of the state public education budget. What would it mean in this example from Carter County, a Florida scale program that spends 30% of what the state spends on public schools to support private school vouchers coming out of the public school budget. That would mean a 19% reduction in the Carter County budget. That's the equivalent of funding 93 educators and $9.6 million annually. The fact sheets also show, what is the situation locally in that county in terms of public and private schools. And Carter County is an example of a school that does have one private school but has 14 public schools. And those sort of numbers are very typical across the state. 90% of Kentucky students go to public schools. So in most counties, there are no private schools, or there's a much larger number of public schools than there are private schools. Um, I'll mention briefly, this report only looks at part of the harms, specifically looking at total state dollars available for education shifting from public schools to private schools. But there's another hit that districts will face as some students leave and take vouchers and go to private schools. They will lose per pupil funding, which is how the state formula works. It's based on the number of attendance, basically on the number of students that attend those schools. So particularly probably in the counties that have more private schools, there will be some students leave. The vast majority will remain in public schools, but some students will leave. But districts and schools will not be able to reduce their costs proportionally to the per pupil funding that they lose. So that's just common sense. If you have 300 students in a school, if 30 of them leave to take a voucher, go to private school, it's still going to cost the same amount of money to heat and cool that school. If you have 25 kids in a classroom, two of them leave, take a voucher, go to private school, the school's still paying that teacher's salary, right? So it's going to squeeze um, school funding in a secondary way if we allow these sort of programs. Um, so that's the bulk of what our report does. We also put out a couple of other pieces that I want to go over before we open up to questions. One is that we also looked at what could we do instead of vouchers. So um, as I said earlier, the funding for any sort of private school voucher program is very, very likely, almost assured to come out of the funding for public schools. But let's just imagine for a moment we did have some extra money somehow. Are vouchers the best way to spend it? Are subsidies for private schools the best way to spend that extra money? We would argue no, that there are proven strategies and outstanding needs in our public schools that haven't been filled as the state has reduced funding over the past couple of decades that would cost the same as a full-scale voucher program like you see in Florida, but actually have a lot of evidence behind them that they work to improve student achievement, to deliver better outcomes, to make kids healthier and have long-term benefits. And this graph just shows, and we have an analysis that lays it out, for $1.19 billion, which is what a Florida scale program would cost in Kentucky, what would that pay for in our public schools? And as the graph shows, it would pay for a 10% educator pay raise. That would make up most of the ground that's been lost in average teacher pay since 2008 and help address the severe shortage of teachers, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, and so forth that we have in our system. We could also reduce class sizes by 10%, a strategy that has mounds of evidence behind it that it works in terms of improving student achievement, student behavior, in terms of just allowing that one-to-one interaction that we know is so important in the classroom. We could also create universal preschool for 4-year-olds, which is a proven strategy, for $4 of return for every dollar that we put into high quality early childhood education. We could fully fund student transportation, so the cost of getting kids to and from school, which the state has not fully funded since 2004. The legislature has not fully funded since 2004, despite a law requiring that they do so. We could also do that, $85 million. We could provide free school meals for all students. That's another strategy where there's a lot of evidence coming out about how good nutrition makes a big difference in students' learning in terms of their health and their long-term outcomes. We could restore the funding for textbooks and professional development that hasn't been funded since 2018, and it's sort of a necessary part of a good education. And then we could create a teacher student loan forgiveness program to help attract more people into the profession. There's a decrease in number of college students going into teacher preparation programs as the salaries sag, as the respect for public schools sags. We see fewer students entering that type of program, which we have a pilot for now, but fully funding that type of program could help attract people to the profession and keep them as their loans are forgiven over time and they stay in the profession. So we could do all those things for a Florida scale program. For a smaller program, we could do a portion of them, but there are things that work, we know work, that aren't being done now. And then I know there have been a lot of mailers and commercials going out saying things about Amendment 2, like it will increase funding for public education and will increase teacher pay. These things are absolutely false. There is nothing in the Constitution now that prohibits the General Assembly from increasing funding for public schools and increasing teacher pay. This is something they can do every time they meet. So there's absolutely no way in which Amendment 2 enables that. And in fact, it does the opposite because, as we learn, we learn in our schools about subtraction. If there's less money in the pot for funding public schools, it's less likely that we're going to have the money we need and the teachers are going to get the pay that is competitive. And in fact, uh, if you look at states that have private school voucher programs, they spend thousands of dollars less per pupil on their public schools. And as this graph shows, they spend the average teacher salary is thousands of dollars less, even when you take the different cost of living of different states into account. So this shows just taking cost of living into account over $5,000, roughly $5,000 difference between a state with no vouchers and a state with vouchers. So it's lower in those states with vouchers. In the states that have these universal vouchers that apply to nearly all families, it's even lower. We're looking at about an $8,000 difference in the average teacher pay. So those claims are just completely false. The facts that of what this program will do are obviously not convincing Kentuckians, and so the proponents are making things up, including that it will do the exact opposite of what it will do. Okay, so that's the I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point. That's the end of kind of the overview. We certainly didn't cover all the issues that are come up in Amendment 2. We want to focus primarily on the dollars because that's what this is all about. It's about making dollars available for things that they weren't available for before. And that means taking money away from the public schools that support 90% of Kentucky's kids and making it less likely we can invest in the things that we know work, address the teacher shortage, lower class sizes, improve the quality of education for the vast majority of students. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Adam to see what questions folks might have.
Well, first, Natalie, do you want to do a minute on your part?
No, we'll come back to that at the very end. I do want to say that I believe that I started the meeting late, so we allowed people in, but I don't know if it started late. So people may not know that the Q&A is at the very top of your screen if you're new to Teams. So if you have questions, that button is right beside the chat at the very top left of your screen. Just wanted to make that announcement again, just because I noticed we got started a few minutes late and I want to make sure that everyone heard that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so feel free to drop questions in there. But I have one to start with, Jason, and it is about that second sentence in the amendment, which notwithstands 7 sections of the Constitution. Could you talk a little bit more about what that means and really what it could mean?
Yeah, so we have a piece on that issue that we published, I believe, yesterday on our website, written by our senior fellow, Pam Thomas. But this amendment is written extremely broadly. And, by notwithstanding 7 sections of the Constitution, it really removes all the protections that were in place to ensure or to require, I should say, an equitable system of common schools. So we really don't know all the implications of what that might mean. We know it opens the door wide open to private school voucher programs, again, to the shifting of money from public schools to private schools. But if you look at the details of the parts of the Constitution that are being suspended here, there are other implications as well. Clearly, the funding of religious schools of various kinds could happen and can go far beyond vouchers. You could see things like funding the construction of religious schools, which is happening in some of these states like Ohio currently. Other, transportation to private schools, other things that go far beyond even a voucher program. Um, Also, one of those sections that's being suspended in the Constitution has to do with special legislation. So, in the management of our system of public schools, there's a requirement that particular districts or geographic areas or other special characteristics don't receive particular favoritism or punishment. And that is being suspended here. So there's no reason why the General Assembly after this, in their implementation of it, couldn't pass legislation that defunds or makes it more equitable the funding of certain districts, says the state is only going to fund some districts and not others, that it's going to fund some more than others. It really wipes away all those requirements that we've had in place to create an equitable system of common schools throughout Kentucky. So the implications of this are vast, and they're essentially permanent unless the Constitution is changed again. So if you hear current lawmakers say, oh, we're not going to do anything radical with this, even if that was true, if you believe them, they're not always going to be our lawmakers. These are permanent changes to the Constitution. And so a generation from now, or 2 generations from now, or 3 generations from now, do we want to give our legislature carte blanche to do whatever they want to do regarding school funding and the equity of school funding and the accountability of school funding? I don't think we do. And I think that it opens a potential Pandora's box of problems far into the future.
Thank you. You mentioned some of the claims being made by proponents of the amendment that we don't agree with. One that I often hear, I read it in the Courier Journal opinion page today, was about record funding for public schools. What could you say about that?
Well, ever since the Great Recession hit in 2008, the state has been eroding funding for public schools, shifting the responsibility over to the state level, to the local level. More school districts have had to try to raise taxes to make up the difference. They haven't been able to do that. And the cuts have added up. There have been many years where funding was frozen. There were some years where it was cut. There are other years where it just didn't keep up with inflation. And over time, that really adds up. So if you look at SEEK funding, which is the core, is the funding formula for our schools, the total amount of money is 26% less now than it was back in 2008 because of the cumulative effect of those cuts over time. So the state has really pulled back in terms of its funding for public schools in real dollars. And that's contributed directly to the teacher shortage, the bus driver shortage. We've seen reductions in things like number of school days. We've seen reductions in after-school activities, in support services, other things that are really important to a good education. And we've seen the gap grow between wealthy and poor school districts because, again, that's one of the state's roles under the Constitution. But the gap between the funding levels of the wealthiest 20% and the poorest 20% of school districts has grown so that it is back to the level that was declared unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court in the 1980s because of state funding reductions. So if year after year after year, you get, it's time for your annual evaluation at your job and you get and your boss tells you you get $1 increase in your salary, do you go back home and tell your family, let's celebrate. I got a record funding. I have a record salary. No, you don't, because the cost of living is going up a lot more than that. But that's been happening in Kentucky going back to 2008. We now have a budget that goes through 2026, so that's 18 years of that trend. And so there's no question that the trajectory since that time period has been in the wrong direction.
Thank you. We did have one person mention that they lost audio. So I just checked with someone on the call via text, and they said that they can hear. So I don't know if that's just with them, but unless there's other issues, we'll just keep going and ask one more question, unless more come in, and that is, what happens if this amendment loses? Are there other avenues for the voucher movement in Kentucky?
Well, I think that the reason that the proponents have put this on the ballot is that they are not able to move forward these things legislatively. The court unanimously threw out the private school tax credit program. And so, I think that there would have to be another attempt to put it on the ballot, or perhaps a change in the courts. But again, if there's a 7-0 ruling against the existing private school voucher program, that would make it very difficult for that to happen, and it would take likely a long time. So the vote on November 5th is very, very consequential for Kentucky. We could be the counterexample to what's going on in some states. I should say there are a bunch of states. It's not like this is happening everywhere. There are a bunch of states that have never gone down this road as well. They don't have these universal voucher programs that are eating up their budgets. But some of the nearby states are. And so as they go deeper and deeper in the hole, as they bust their budgets with their spending on private school vouchers, Kentucky can continue to stand out as a counterexample to what it means to remain committed to the longstanding constitutional commitment to public education. And, it will leave us with, one option, which is to take resources we have, including billions of dollars right now that are in the rainy day fund in the legislature, and reinvest in public education finally. Reverse those trends since 2008 and recommit to the schools that serve 90% of Kentucky's kids and are really the cornerstone of our democracy and building a good Kentucky.
So we did have a question come in, and I think you could speak to this, Jason. It's about what would be an effective message for rural voters?
Well, I think rural Kentuckians, and I grew up in a rural part of Tennessee myself, so I'm somewhat familiar with this feeling that in rural areas that a lot has been taken from you, over time. People feel like jobs have been lost, that young people have left, that they're that we/they are, looked down on by people in more prosperous areas. And all those things are true. And here is a great example of another thing that will do the same thing. As we've outlined, and we outlined in this report and have outlined tonight, Amendment 2 will result in policies that take money out of public schools, especially in rural areas, reduce the number of teachers, potentially even lead to more school closures, which they've already had problems with as depopulation happens. That takes away money, it takes away jobs, it takes away educational opportunities, and it takes away schools that are often, or resources from schools that are often not only the largest employer in a lot of rural areas, but the heartbeat of the community, the place where people go to band concerts, they go to football games, they in many cases, generations have attended. So I think understanding what's at stake, the unfairness of what would happen, is a very convincing message to a lot of rural people, if they're able to, if they hear it and if they are exposed to the best and to accurate information.
I see that we've got Barbara's hand up, so I think I'm going to allow your microphone. This is our first time using Teams, so we're checking out all the different things. So Barbara, let's see, you should be able to come off mute now.
My question is, do you have a rundown for each county as you showed that one example?
Yes, we do. We have fact sheets for every school district. So not just every county, but every school district. And that's on our website with the report itself, there's a fact sheet for every district showing the potential impact of a Florida scale program.
Well, we're having a forum with Together Frankfurt Thursday night on this topic. Is there a way for me, I mean, can you fax me that or email it to me for Franklin County?
Natalie's nodding her head, yes.
I feel like all three of us are nodding our heads, being like, yes, absolutely, we can make that happen.
Okay, that'd be great. Absolutely great. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. And Mary Jo Moeller, you also had your hand raised. So I think I can allow your mic if you wanted to ask a question. Maybe. Well, she may have stepped away from her computer, so I'm just going to lower her hand for now.
She may not know that she's got to unmute too.
Oh yeah, you do have
At
to
the
unmute
top.
yourself as well. Thank you, Barbara. Well, not hearing anything. We did have one other question in the Q&A. Could the reduction in funding impact sports and other extracurricular programs?
No question about it. I mean, that's just part of the school budget. So, in fact, I heard somebody say today that often what gets cut first are things that people really love. Students really love because they're core requirements like math, and some people like math, but math and reading that are sort of tested on, it's harder to cut them. But things like arts programs, like band programs, like sports programs, often see the first cuts. So no question about that.
All right. Do we want to roll on into how y'all can help? All right. Well, hopefully, in this time that we've shared together, you can see that this is a very large, big issue, and hopefully you are just as interested in helping out. Make sure that we can destroy Amendment 2 with vote no's across the board. We are 3 weeks away, and we have been working with the Protect Our Schools Kentucky campaign, and they have 3 ways for you to volunteer right now. They have voter contact phone banks happening 6 days a week. So there are groups across the state who have signed up to do phone banking together or virtually, and they have those going on 6 days a week, which means they need lots of hands and lots of people on those phones. And so that is one opportunity. There are canvassing opportunities this weekend in Ashland, Richmond, Boone County, Lexington, Henderson, and Louisville. Canvassing means that you are going out and talking to your neighbors about the issue directly. But these are opportunities where people are already set up to do that. So you would not be going alone, of course. You would be going with a group of people who would train you on how to talk about this issue. And just make sure that the voters in Kentucky know what's going on. And then lastly, there's a digital organizing trainings happening weekly. So in order to be a digital organizer, which is something that you can do on your very own time with your phone and your contacts, you do need to attend a digital organizer training, and those are still going on a weekly basis. So with all of these different opportunities, I didn't want to bombard you with tons of different links. So you can go to protectourschoolsky.com. And here you can see I've kind of tried to circle the take action button at the top. That will take you to mobilize.us/protectourschoolsky. And that'll give you all of the different opportunities that you can participate in. Again, those are voter contact phone banks, canvassing opportunities, and digital organizing trainings are the things that you would be looking for in order to volunteer in your area. And of course, talking to your friends and your neighbors, being your own personal digital organizer by speaking about this online is absolutely incredibly important and pinnacle to us being able to stop this happening in Kentucky. Of course, KY Policy has tons of KY Policy, and lots of other organizations have online content that you can share. I know that Adam has been really active on Instagram and TikTok and everywhere trying to push this message. And we need everyone's hands, all hands on deck, everybody out there talking about the issue. But again, protectourschoolsky.com is going to get you to this information.